Welcome to the Future of Earth session. I'm Joel Premack. Martin Rees is also has his camera on, and he'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. We've slightly modified the program, so you see the modified program times on your screen. So there'll only be a brief amount of time for questions at the end of each talk, but then there'll be almost half an hour for discussion among the panel, and also further responses to questions from the audience that you type in on the Slido. And then everybody is welcome to join the after session networking Zoom link, and that'll be live and a normal Zoom session, so everybody can talk to everybody else for about half an hour after the session ends. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Martin, why don't you start your talk?
Okay. All right. Yes. Sorry about this.
It worked just a moment ago.
Yes, I know. I can't. Oh, okay. Yes. Right. Good. Yep. Okay. Well, because I've got the title Astronomer Royal, I'm often asked, do you do the Queen's horoscopes? But I say I'm just an astronomer, not an astrologer. And scientists are rotten forecasters, almost as bad as economists. But I've nonetheless written a book, well, pretentiously called On the Future. But my forecast will be very tentative. The theme of the book is this: the Earth existed for 45 million centuries, but this century is special. It is first when one species, ours, has the planet's future in its hands. And COVID-19 must be a wake-up call, reminding us that our interconnected world is vulnerable. But I'll start by focusing on two things we can predict, even with a cloudy crystal ball. The world will get more crowded and it will get warmer. 50 years ago, the world population was about 3.5 billion. It's now about 7.8 billion. The growth being mainly in Asia and Africa. And this distorted map, can you see this? Yeah, this distorted map.
And you need to share your screen.
Sorry?
You have to share your screen.
Sorry. Did you see the earlier slide or not?
Yes, it worked fine before.
But not this one.
But not since you started talking.
Ah, you can't see these.
No, we're still seeing you.
Oh dear. I'll share. Let's try. Yeah.
There you go.
That's all right.
We're seeing that the distorted.
Yes. Okay. Well, yes.
Great.
Well, you didn't miss very much, but this distorted map shows each country scale by the population growth in that country during the last 30 years. And the number of births per year worldwide is actually going down now in most countries, but nonetheless, world population is forecast to rise to about 9 billion by mid-century. And that's partly because most people in the developing world are young. They have to have children. And the age histogram, let me see there. Oh dear. I can't forward the slides now. Yes, okay.
There it goes.
The age histogram in the developing world will become like it is in Europe. West Africa on the left, Europe on the right. Despite doom-laden forecasts in the 1960s, food productions kept pace with rising population. Famines occur, but they're due to conflict or maldistribution, not overall scarcity. But to feed 9 billion by mid-century will require further improved agriculture, low-till, water-conserving and GM crops, and maybe dietary innovations like insects and artificial meat. But to quote Gandhi, there's enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Projections beyond 2050 are uncertain. It's not even clear whether there'll be a global rise or fall. But that's all I want to say about population, although it is crucial that we ensure that it doesn't lead to great inequalities in places like Africa, where the demographic transition hasn't yet happened. But another thing, if humanity's collective impact on land use and climate pushes too hard, the resultant ecological shock could irreversibly impoverish our biosphere. Extinction rates are rising. We're destroying the book of life before we've read it. Already there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows, and domestic animals is 20 times that in wild mammals. Biodiversity is crucial for human well-being. But for many environmentalists, preserving it has value in its own right. To quote the great ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. So the world's getting more crowded. And as another firm predicts, it'll get warmer. In contrast to population issues, climate change is certainly not under-discussed, though it is under-responded to. The fifth IPCC report presented a spread of projections with different assumptions about future fossil use. It's still unclear how much the climatic effects of CO2 are amplified by changes in water vapor and clouds. That's a further uncertainty indicated by the vertical bars on the right of the slide. And the need for urgent action will be the theme of the COP26 meeting in Glasgow this November. Under business as usual scenarios, we can't rule out later this century really catastrophic warming and tipping points triggering long-term trends like the melting of Greenland's ice. But to insert a bit of good cheer, there is a win-win roadmap to a low-carbon future. Nations should accelerate their R&D into all forms of low-carbon energy generation, including nuclear, in my view, and into other technologies where parallel progress is crucial, especially storage and smart grids. The faster these clean energy technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall, so they become affordable to the developing world, where more generating capacity is needed, and where the health of the poor is jeopardized by smoky stoves burning wood or dung, and where there'll otherwise be pressure to build coal-fired power stations without CCS. And if all else fails, then we have to resort to geoengineering, not just CCS at power stations, but extracting CO2 from the atmosphere. But it would be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than devising clean and affordable energy systems for the world. That's what we need. We should be evangelists for new technology, not Luddites. Without it, the world can't provide food and sustainable energy for an expanding and more demanding population. Indeed, many of us are anxious that it's advancing so fast that we may not properly cope with it, and we'll have a bumpy ride through the century. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics offer prospects of containing natural pandemics. But the same research raises And it's my, sorry, I'm having problems again. Yes. Yep. And it's my worst nightmare, the prospect of engineered pandemics. Here's the influenza virus. And in 2012, a group in Wisconsin and one in Holland showed it was surprisingly easy to make this virus more virulent and more transmissible. To some, this was a scary portent of things to come. And the new CRISPR-Cas9 technique for gene editing is highly promising, but raises ethical concerns and also worries about gene drive. Sorry. Where it's possible to make a species extinct. Okay, if it's a mosquito, not so good if it's a squirrel, and possible runaway consequences of this may happen to the ecology. So regulation of this biotech is needed, but I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that's a nightmare. Whereas an atomic bomb can't be built without large-scale special purpose facilities, biotech involves small-scale dual-use equipment. Indeed, biohacking is burgeoning even as a hobby. The global village will have its village idiots, and they'll have global range. And the rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups by biotech and by cybertech as well will pose an intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between freedom, privacy, and security. These concerns are fairly near term, the next 10 or 15 years. But what about 2050 and beyond? On the bio front, we might expect two things: a better understanding of the combination of genes that determine key human characteristics, and secondly, the ability to synthesize genomes that match these features. Freeman Dyson conjectured a time when children will be able to design and create new organisms, just as his generation played with chemistry sets. If it becomes possible to play God on a kitchen table, as it were, our ecology and even our species may not survive long unscathed. And what about another transformative technology, robotics and AI? There have been exciting advances in machine learning. DeepMind's AlphaGo Zero computer famously achieved world championship level in the games of Go and chess in just a few hours. It was given just the rules and learned by playing against itself over and over again. Its processing speed allowed it to complete several games every second. And computers are, of course, getting faster, as on that graph. The implications for our society are already ambivalent. If we're sentenced to a term in prison, recommended for surgery, or even given a poor credit rating, we expect the reasons to be accessible to us and contestable by us. If they're entirely delegated to an algorithm, we'd be entitled to feel uneasy, even if presented with compelling evidence that on average, the machines make better decisions than the humans they've usurped. Many experts think that AI, like synthetic biology, already needs guidelines for responsible innovation. And the incipient shifts in the nature of work, they've been addressed in several excellent books. Clearly, machines are going to take over much of manufacturing and retail distribution. They can supplement, if not replace, many white-collar jobs, routine legal work, computer coding, medical diagnostics, and even surgery. In contrast, skilled non-routine service sector jobs, like plumbing and gardening, will be among the hardest jobs to automate. And to create a humane society, governments will need to vastly enhance the number and status of those who care for the old, the young, and the sick. There are currently too few, and they're too poorly paid. And these are far more fulfilling jobs than work in Amazon call centers or warehouses, where we should welcome an AI takeover. Computers succeed by reinforced learning on big data sets. But learning about human behavior involves observing real people in real homes or workplaces. And the machine will be sensorily deprived by the slowness of real life. It's like us watching trees grow. And this is why it's hard to teach robots common sense. And they're still clumsier than a child in moving pieces on a real chessboard. They can't jump from tree to tree like a squirrel. There was a Boston Dynamics robot, this one, which can apparently do somersaults. But sensor technology is advancing fast. And this, incidentally, is the human who was defeated in the game of Go. He has the advantage because he uses only about 30 watts of power, like a light bulb, and he can do many other things other than play Go, whereas the computer used hundreds of kilowatts. Well, looking further ahead, how human-like will robots become? Will they develop minds of their own? Popular culture portrays a dark side, where AI gets out of its box, infiltrates the internet, and pursues goals misaligned with human interest, or even treats humans as an encumbrance. And some AI pundits take this seriously. But there are others, like Rodney Brooks, inventor of the Baxter robot. He thinks it will be a long time before artificial intelligence will worry us more than real stupidity does. But be it as it may, it's likely that society will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on whether they'll be idiot savant or display superhuman capabilities. This is Ray Kurzweil, a futurologist now working at Google, and he argues that once machines have surpassed human capabilities, they themselves design and assemble a new generation of even more powerful ones, an intelligence explosion. He wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines, where he predicted that humans would transcend biology by merging with computers. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. But he's worried that his nirvana may not happen in his lifetime. So he wants his body frozen in liquid nitrogen until it's reached. And the company in Arizona will freeze and store your body. So when immortality's on offer, you can be resurrected or your brain downloaded. I'd rather end my own days in an English churchyard than the Californian refrigerator. But of course, research on aging is being seriously prioritized. Will the benefits be incremental, or is aging a disease that can be cured? Dramatic life extension will plainly be a real wild card in population projections, with huge social ramifications. But it may happen along with human enhancement in other forms. It's at least surely on the cards that human beings, their mentality and their physique, may become malleable through deployment of genetic modification and cyborg technology. Moreover, this future evolution, a kind of secular intelligent design, will take only centuries, in contrast to the thousands of centuries needed for Darwinian evolution. And this is a game changer. When we admire the literature and artifacts that have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity across a gulf of 2,000 or 3,000 years with these ancient artists and their civilizations. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional resonance with us. They may just have an algorithmic understanding of how we behave. And let me inject an astronomical perspective on timescales. It's taken 4 billion years for us to evolve by Darwinian selection from the very first life. But the sun's less than halfway through its life, the cosmos may go on forever. So we humans may be nearer the beginning than the end of the emergence of complexity. And that's accelerating. And we can have no conception whatever of the complexities of the vast cosmic future. This speculation leads to another technology, space. Because it's beyond our Earth, in environments hostile to humans, that cyborgs and AI have the most spectacular scope, and where these changes will happen fastest and should worry us less. During this century, the whole solar system will be explored by swarms of miniaturized probes, far more advanced than the wonderful Cassini, which spent 13 years exploring Saturn and its moons, or the NASA probe, which sent back these pictures from Pluto 12,000 times further away than the moon. The next step will be deployment in space or on the moon of robotic fabricators. We can build large structures For instance, giant telescopes with huge gossamer thin mirrors, or other astronomical equipment. But what about human spaceflight? The practical case for this gets weaker with each advance in robots and miniaturization. So will it have a resurgence? It's more than 50 years since Neil Armstrong's one small step, and I cherish this picture signed for me a few years ago by 7 Apollo astronauts. Hundreds more have ventured into space, of course, since then, but anticlimactically, they've done no more than circle the Earth in low Earth orbit. So will there be any inspirational Apollo-type projects in future? NASA's manned program, ever since Apollo, has been impeded by public and political pressure into being very risk-averse. The space shuttle failed twice in 135 launches. Astronauts, test pilots, and adventurers would willingly accept a 2% risk, but the shuttle was unwisely promoted as safe for civilians. And because of this safety culture, NASA will confront political obstacles, I think, in achieving any grand goal within a feasible budget. That's why I think the future of human spaceflight lies with privately funded adventurers prepared to participate in a cut-price program far riskier than Western nations could impose on publicly supported civilians. Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin will soon be offering orbital flights to paying customers. And there'll still be volunteers, some perhaps even accepting one-way tickets, driven by the same motives as early explorers, mountaineers, and the like. And the phrase space tourism should be avoided because it lulls people into thinking such ventures are routine and low risk. They must be sold as dangerous sports or intrepid exploration. But by 2100, courageous thrill seekers may have established bases independent from the Earth, on Mars or maybe on asteroids. And Musk himself, who's age 49, says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. But don't ever expect mass emigration from the Earth. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. And here I disagree with Musk and with my late colleague Stephen Hawking. I think it's a dangerous delusion to think space offers an escape from Earth's problems. Dealing with the climate change on Earth is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. Nonetheless, we should cheer on these brave space adventurers because they'll have a pivotal role in spearheading the post-human future in the 22nd century and far beyond. And this is why they'll be ill-adapted to their new habitat. So they'll have a more compelling incentive than we on Earth do to redesign themselves. They'll harness the super powerful genetic and cyborg technologies that will be developed in coming decades. These techniques will, we hope, be regulated here on Earth, but they're beyond the clutches of the regulators. And we should surely wish them good luck in modifying their progeny to adapt to alien environments. So it's these spacefaring adventurers, not those of us comfortably adapted to life on Earth, who will spearhead the post-human era. But now, just to finish, back to the nearer term. The historical record reveals episodes when civilizations have crumbled on Earth. But the difference now is that our world is so interconnected that a catastrophe couldn't hit any region without the consequences cascading globally. And by the way, pandemics not only spread fast, as they didn't in the past, they caused far worse societal breakdown. European villages in the 14th century continued to function even when the Black Death halved their population. In contrast, society today would be vulnerable to serious unrest as soon as hospitals were overwhelmed, which would occur before the death toll was even 1%. And from COVID-19, it's been about 0.3% in the US and the UK. Biologists should avoid creation of potentially devastating modified pathogens or large-scale modification of the human germline.
5 minutes, Martin.
Sorry?
5 minutes.
Oh, less than that. Okay, yes. Cyber experts are aware of the risk of a cascading breakdown in global infrastructure. Innovators who deploy advanced AI should avoid scenarios where a machine takes over. We may dismiss these risks as science fiction, but given the stakes, they should not be ignored, even if deemed highly improbable. On the other hand, when we think about the next 50 years or so, we've got to accept that innovations have an upside too. Application of the precautionary principle has an opportunity cost. There's a hidden cost of saying no. Opinion polls show, unsurprisingly, that younger people are more engaged and anxious about long-term and global issues, and their activism gives us ground for hope. So what should be our message to them? It's surely that there's no scientific impediment to achieving a sustainable world where all enjoy a lifestyle better than those in the West do today. We live under the shadow of new risks, but these can be minimized by a culture of responsible innovation, especially in fields I've discussed, like biotech and advanced AI. So we can be technological optimists, but the intractable politics and sociology engenders pessimism. The scenarios I've described could trigger serious, even catastrophic setbacks to our society. And of course, most of the challenges are global. Coping with COVID-19 plainly is. And the threats of potential shortages of food, water, and natural resources, and transitioning to low carbon energy can't be solved by each nation separately. Indeed, I think in a new world order, nations will surely have to give up more sovereignty to new organizations along the lines of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the WHO, etc. And there's got to be the political will, and politicians won't prioritize issues where the benefits accrue mainly to distant parts of the world and the decades in the future, unless there's public pressure, unless they know the public behind them. And that's why we should welcome public demonstrations and also the intervention of charismatic figures. In fact, there's been a huge influence by the rather disparate quartet of David Attenborough, Pope Francis, Bill Gates, and Greta Thunberg. And I'll end with a flashback to the Middle Ages. For medieval people, the entire cosmology, from creation to apocalypse, spanned only a few thousand years. They were bewildered and helpless in the face of floods and pestilences, and prone to irrational dread. Large parts of Earth were terra incognita. But they built cathedrals, constructed with primitive technology by masons who knew they wouldn't live to see them finished. Vast and glorious buildings. This is Ely Cathedral, near where I live, that still inspire us centuries later. Our horizons in space and time are now vastly extended, as are our resources and knowledge. But we don't plan centuries ahead. At first, it seemed a paradox, but there is a reason. Medieval lives played out against a backdrop which changed little from one generation to the next. They were confident they'd have grandchildren who would appreciate the finished cathedral. But for us, unlike for them, the next century will be drastically different from the present. We can't foresee it, so it's harder to plan for it. There's now a huge disjunction between the ever-shortening timescale of social and technical change and the billion-year time spans of biology, geology, and cosmology. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support system is vulnerable to disruption and breakdowns. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning. And we need to think globally, rationally, and long-term, empowered by 21st century science, but guided by values that science alone can't provide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. So stop sharing, please.
Right.
Thanks. So this is the revised program on your screen. We've shortened the talks a little bit to allow a long period of discussion at the end. There was a mistake apparently by the Freeman Company so that the Q&A didn't appear when you first logged into the session. If you simply start a new browser window and log in again, the Q&A will appear. There were no questions, I think, because of this problem. for Martin Rees's talk. So let's just continue now with Anthony Aguirre's talk. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Anthony can start.
Okay. Good. So thanks, Joel, for organizing this really interesting session, and Martin, always a pleasure to hear what you have to say. So I'm going to start at the beginning. 13.8 billion years ago, our universe was a really pretty boring, hot, dense, nearly uniform, expanding gas of just elementary particles and fields: photons, protons, neutrons, neutrinos, dark matter, dark energy. And the standard cosmological model that we've worked out has given us a beautiful accounting of the quantities of these constituents, as well as how this early medium has evolved into the universe of clusters and galaxies and stars and planets and other structures. And theories of the early universe, especially inflation, have given us a compelling and quantitative and predictive account of how that early universe got its properties. It also gives us a quite beautiful explanation in terms of the balance of positive and negative energy of where all that energy making up those particles and fields came from. But it also, that early universe, had a vast quantity of something else, which is only sometimes talked about. Along with an immense amount of matter and radiation, it also contained an immense amount of information. That may sound odd. Information, in the way that Shannon defined it, is like a deficit of entropy. And our cosmic medium started out boring, largely in equilibrium, maximum entropy. So where was the information? Well, as Roger Penrose and a number of other cosmologists since, including myself, have argued, when we include space-time degrees of freedom, the scale and smoothness of the universe, that early universe as a whole was very special and very low entropy and very information rich indeed. And I think it's safe to say that unlike all the stuff, nobody has a compelling explanation as to where all this information came from. I think it's a central question of cosmology. But however it arose, there it was 13.8 billion years ago. And since then, it's been transformed by physical processes into quite different forms that we can identify as reservoirs of information or put more thermodynamically free energy that can be used. Cosmic homogeneity, in particular, allows formation of interesting, well-spaced structures much hotter than the surroundings. And the chemical simplicity of the cosmic medium allows stellar nuclear fusion, which provides high energy photons that can shine, among other places, on planets. And stars, when you think about it, really are a marvel. This is a movie of 10 years of the sun in 1 minute. You can download high resolution ones from NASA, and it just burns and burns. It's kind of chaotic, but also very steady. Now imagine watching this movie 500 million times in a row. That's how long the sun has steadily and reliably provided nice information and free energy rich photons for us. I find this oddly moving. And it enabled something quite amazing of order 4 billion years ago here on Earth, a chemical process that has acquired the ability to reproduce and evolve units that metabolize. They're capable of extracting energy or free energy and using it to maintain their own structure. We call this metabolism. But it's not unreasonable, I think, to consider this sort of information processing with a specific purpose of turning food into itself as computation. And this arguably computational process, life, does things quite distinct from every other physical process we know about. It has goals to stay alive, to acquire resources, to reproduce. It has intelligence broadly defined, perceiving and modeling the world and itself in relation to those goals. It has agency, it makes choices and takes actions to accomplish them. And this is something qualitatively new, in which the best explanation for many phenomena is not the laws of physics did it, but it happened in pursuit of this goal. We have no evidence that this process, life, exists anywhere else in the observable universe. And to those that say, but look at all those stars, of course it must. Well, I say probabilities, especially of chance events, including many parts, can be very, very, very small. This is RNA polymerase. If the origin of life required a chance arrangement of many atoms, not to speak of this many, there's just no way that it happened twice in the observable universe. That may well have been. So I think all bets are off. It could be plentiful. We could be alone. But here we are. And an astonishingly short thousands of years ago, life created technology, complex, deliberately designed physical systems to help us achieve our goals. We have no evidence that this process technology exists anywhere else in the universe either. But here it is. Where's it going? Not just in the next decade or two, but in the really long term. What's the future of life and of technology? Well, as Martin has pointed out, we don't know, of course. We can't know. But science is based fundamentally on both explaining and predicting. And of course, we can make predictions about anything, though granted, some predictions are just much more or less precise than others. But what can we do here? Well, one thing we can do is to look at the long-term future of the physical universe. And there, the news is essentially all good in a sense. There's a lot of time, not forever, but a lot. Probably 10 to 100 million years until the next natural mass extinction event, making the Earth substantially less habitable than it is now. And about 1 billion years until the Earth itself gets too hot to support a biosphere like ours. Solar system appears to be stable on billion or 10 billion years timescale. And we will start to lose galaxies in our night sky due to the cosmological constant pushing them away. But we've got about 100 billion years until the local group is on its own. Stars will be around for of order 10 to the 14 years. That's a really long time. Those will be small, dwarf, lower mass ones, not the exciting ones we have now, but they'll continue to burn and provide habitability. The galaxy, even if it's of burnt out remnants, will be around for around 10 to the 20 years, and protons themselves for 10 to the 34. So there's a very long time, certainly relative to the 100-year time scale of our technology, that the Earth will stay nice and pleasant and hospitable. Now that's the easy part though, because stars and galaxies and black holes and the like are ultimately very simple systems in their overall behavior, even if getting the details and the particulars is very hard. But in terms of predictions, life and technology throw a big wrench in that. And let me give you an example that's kind of fun. Several years ago, I started an online platform called Metaculus to solicit, aggregate, and keep score of predictions of all kinds. And it's since grown to thousands of questions, a community of many thousands of predictors, and it recently recorded its 500,000th prediction. And it works quite well with a publicly viewable track record as a system that's better than any individual's. So it's quite good at predicting things, at least where we've seen whether they come true or not. And here's a fun question. Will there be a total solar eclipse on June 25th, 2522? What's your prediction? I've redacted for now the Metaculus forecast, but I'll give you a big clue. Here's NASA's table of eclipses for 2500 to 2600. And there it is down there in the corner, the 7-minute, 12-second eclipse passing over Southern Africa and the Indian Ocean. So what's the Metaculus prediction for this? 88%. 88%? No, the system isn't broken. The people there can read, and this prediction is dominated by the predictors with the very best track record. So what are they talking about? Why 88%? Well, because 500 years is a long time in a technological civilization in which things are happening on a decade timescale. And so many predictors actually ascribe a non-negligible probability that humanity may have engineered the solar system enough to interfere with eclipses. And whether you want to go that far or not, if you think about it, it's clearly true that the dominant uncertainty in that eclipse is not, as NASA lists it, uncertainties in the rate of the Earth's rotation, but what we will be up to in the meantime. Let's look at another somewhat disquieting question that may be related. The probability of human-machine intelligence parity by 2040. 47%. The parity referred to here is the ability for an AI system to outperform physics, computer science, and math grad students on a 2-hour exam composed to advantage the humans. It's a very strong test. Depending on who you ask or how you define it, high level or general or transformative artificial intelligence is a ways off, but it's no longer some faraway, dismissible fantasy. In the last 5 years, as Martin has talked about, we've seen reinforcement learning techniques develop so that a single basic architecture can, through self-play alone, become superhuman at essentially any full knowledge like Go and chess game, and many hidden knowledge like StarCraft and poker games. As Max Tegmark likes to put it, AI can not just beat us at playing chess, but also at creating chess-playing systems. GPT-3, if you've not seen it, can write essays that produce an amazing facsimile of intelligence and understanding, and frankly, read better than a lot of pieces by college students, I hate to say it. And it can write simple computer programs and add 1 and 2 digit numbers, even though it was never actually trained to do those things, purely through analyzing text. And some problems, thought to be quite hard until like combining different sensory modes like text and images, are turning out to be almost non-problems. Take a look at OpenAI's DALL-E system, which creates visual images in response to a text prompt. So the text prompt here is an illustration of a baby penguin in a cape playing a grand piano. And this is what the system pops out with instantly. You can change the baby penguin to an elephant and the cape to a wizard hat and playing a grand piano to skipping along the beach, and an illustration to a black and white photograph. And it will also give you 15 instant photographs of an elephant in a wizard hat skipping along the beach. It's an extraordinary thing. You can go and try it out. And this was done, this fusion of creative, image creation and text, and this is not to minimize the cleverness of the people involved, but more or less just by throwing a bunch of images and related text into the training set and using more or less the same techniques they had before. So we're entering a regime, I think, where systems are showing surprising generality where narrowness is expected, rather than painful narrowness when we hope for generality, as has been the case in the past. Part of what's driven this progress is Moore's law, of course, which, while not quite what it used to be, carries on, exhibiting nearly exponential progress in computing power and energy efficiency. And it's driven by this virtuous cycle. Faster, better computers allow and economically incentivize progress on yet faster and better ones. And AI, I think, has now entered a similar virtuous cycle. AI systems are now valuable commercial products, right? Driving R&D efforts, including dedicated computational hardware that are absolutely dwarfing those of decades past. The top AI conferences now have tens of thousands of attendees after they limit admissions. And Google DeepMind has of order 1,000 well-paid top AI researchers working on artificial general intelligence. That's a lot of firepower, even for the most difficult of problems to sustain. So I think serious progress may happen faster than we think. Copyable, editable, engineerable, scalable intelligence is very exciting. If, as some do, we define intelligence as sort of the ability to just achieve our goals, whatever they are, more of it is better, almost by definition, right? So this promises huge gains in predicting and designing complex systems, in intelligently processing vast amounts of information, and even developing new and important science and technology. It's also, to me, frankly, terrifying. There's simply no chance that the world will be anything like the same as it is now, if or when we're not the most intelligent things on it. And most very, very different ways the world can be are not things we'd like in the big scheme of things. So the world staying pleasing to us will hinge on high-powered AI doing what we want it to do. And at the moment, I and many others that are deeply, deeply worried about the prospects of that. Human minds are incredibly complex, but have been battle-tested into relative stability over eons of evolution in a variety of extremely challenging environments. The first general machine intelligences are unlikely to have been honed in this way. And there are lots of failure modes in the human mind, and many of these can be seen as failure modes for intelligence in general, ways that it can go off the rails, and we've already seen them emerge in AI systems. And this only promises to increase as the power and action space of those systems increase as well. If you'd like to read more about that issue, there's some good books, as Martin mentioned. I recommend these 4 quite compelling ones, ordered in anxiety production from left to right, from, gee, yeah, that's going to be a problem, to, okay, we're totally doomed. So you can choose your poison. What I take from this is that I hope that on the way to human level or higher AI, researchers can really put a lot of thought into how dramatically lower the possibility, the probability that things will go wrong once we get there. Something I find very frustrating in this arena, where the stakes are potentially incredibly high, is when I hear, I think X is going to happen, so I'm not really worried about Y. And that's generally fine way to think, as long as your confidence in X is high and Y is not super important. But when you're talking about something that could radically determine the future, or even the future existence of humanity, 75% confidence is not enough. 90% confidence is not enough. 99 is not enough. We would never have built the Large Hadron Collider, for example, if we thought there was a 1% let alone 10% chance of it actually spawning holes to consume the world. Instead, there were extremely compelling arguments against that. Calculations were done. We were very, very confident that there were not going to be black holes that destroyed the world from the LHC. And we should have similarly compelling reasons to believe that artificial general intelligence can be built safely before we build it. Now, AI is not the only game-changing technology on the horizon, though. In the past 20 years, the cost of sequencing a human genome has fallen 1 millionfold. The rate of progress has slowed a little bit lately, but it's no longer prohibitive and will soon be cheap and fairly ubiquitous. CRISPR is given high precision and effective tools for low-cost gene editing. And what has turned out to be an extremely hard problem, going from genotype to phenotype and back, is showing some cracks. For example, the protein folding problem, which resisted useful solution for decades, has essentially been solved by a machine learning system from DeepMind, AlphaFold, using pretty similar architecture to its Go and chess and StarCraft playing systems. And I expect high-powered machine learning will play a central role in mapping between genetic sequences and functional biological systems in general. So life and technology are, as Martin said also, at least potentially on the cusp of entering an entirely new phase. Rather than evolve, life and intelligence will be designed and engineered. And this transition is just starting, but likely to be immense. Evolution can optimize organisms for particular properties and even operate at a higher level by improving the optimization process itself. And it's created amazing things. If we think about metabolism, or even just DNA transcription as computation, the biosphere on Earth has done of order 10 to the 50 operations, plus or minus a few orders of magnitude. That's a gigantic exponent. The total computation deliberately done by humans is likely of order 10 to the 30 floating point operations, and the very biggest single computations currently done are of order 10 to the 23rd, 27 orders of magnitude smaller. So the current life on Earth is a result of a truly immense computation, if we think of it as output of one. But as impressive as it is, evolution doesn't have understanding, self-modeling, reason, explicit goals that human intelligence does. It's a long and slow process, and it's just not capable of the sort of giant leaps intellect and technology are, especially on the short time scales. And that means that very likely intelligence and not standard biological evolution will govern the long-term future of life. And this goes for life that we may encounter out there in the universe. Bringing this back to the eclipse, or not, in 2522, this makes the long-term of life, future of life, nearly impossible to predict. But there's some things we can say. We can look at what appear to be some pretty durable trends, like Moore's law, and some shorter-term, pretty clear predictions, as Martin has given us, about global warming and population growth. In the long term, we can think about those trends, and we can also think about fundamental limits placed on physics and computation that placed by them that describe how much and how well life can make use of this great bounty of matter and information that the universe provided it. As it turns out, these limits are extraordinarily lax. For example, the energy delivers, the sun delivers 10 to the 14 terawatts of energy, 10 to the 4 of that going to Earth. The human brain consumes, less than 100 watts, so there's a pretty big ratio of energy that we need to just think to energy that we get here on Earth. If you think about the energy generated, if we could just convert matter directly into energy, that's 25 gigawatt hours per gram in units that make it comparable to a large-scale power plant. So one power plant can run roughly for a day on a gram of matter. If we could compute it, we can make full use of it. In computation, there's a limit on irreversible computation given by Landauer that turns out to be 10 to the 19 floating point operations per second per watt. That's 10 to the 33 flops per gram. The maximal storage is between 1 and 100 zettabytes per gram. So a gram of matter can do just a tremendous amount of computation and energy storage, and there are just tons of grams of matters around. Jupiter, 10 to the 30 of them, the Milky Way, 10 to the 44 of them. Now, light is a little bit frustrating. It seems to go so slow when we think about the nearest stars, but it really is quite fast. We can get to stars on years time scale, and we've got 10 to the 10 of those years. We can get to other stars in the galaxy in millennia, and even other galaxies. And
Anthony,
Yeah,
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. And if you think about how much of the future light cone we could actually influence, given where we are now, it turns out to be of radius 1.6 or so times 10 to the 10 light years, and include about 20 billion galaxies. So there's just a lot out there. This is pretty amazing news in terms of the very, very long-term future of life, or even humans as a whole. There's literally an astronomical amount of matter and information out there to harness. And even if we stay here on Earth, there's an incredible bounty if we're able to make use of it in a way that in any sense approaches the fundamental limits. The bad news, of course, is that we can waste this bounty completely, as Martin has eloquently and disturbingly discussed at length. We have the capacity now to destroy our own civilization. We've come close a number of times just by accident. And we may have, or soon have, the capacity to wipe out pretty much all life on Earth. So this age, the next century or two, will either be the one that makes the transition into something quite remarkable, or that dooms itself. We have lots of choices, as I think Sandy's going to talk about, for what to do, but one choice that takes away all the others, which is that if we're foolish enough to let it all fall apart. So what can be done? Well, a lot, I think, and here are a few personal opinions. You've heard some calls to action from Martin, and here are some that are maybe a little bit more under the radar. First, I think how to make artificial general intelligence and advanced AI both robust and beneficial, I think has probably the largest gap between importance and funding or effort of any human endeavor. Close behind, I expect, is the same question applied to genetic engineering and synthetic biology. I believe this enough that the Future of Life Institute, which I've worked with, has worked very hard to fund and direct funding to this research, but it's very, very, very far from enough, I think. We should, as a society, be putting significantly more effort into other risks with relatively small probability but immense cost, or even significant probability. We really like to not think about these risks. We don't like to think about our own deaths, and we have some deep cognitive bias that tells us that somehow bad things happen to other people, other places, and other times. After all, we beat the odds repeatedly, but this is a bit like the philosophical chicken at the farm. For each day of survival adds to the odds that it will survive one more. It's not the right way to think. COVID, a relatively mild catastrophe in the spectrum of possibilities, has at least sensitized us to these global risks. And there may be a window of opportunity, I think, to set up some much, much better infrastructure to spend even a tiny fraction of, for example, what we spend on defending countries to defend and protect life and humanity as a whole. I think in terms of life, we really ought to save what we have by staving off mass extinction underway, and as a backup, sequencing the genome of pretty much every organism we can. Life has run these 10 to the 50 operations, and here we are dragging the output file into the trash can. Let's leave the process running and make a backup. In general, we need much better coordination in terms of calling for policy changes related to science, technology, in the future beyond the next election cycle. I'm hopeful that new institutions leveraging coordinating powers of our online life can maybe arise and make a difference in this. And as Sandy calls for, I think we also need some real global discussion of what we want, not just what we're dragged inexorably toward by technological progress. What, as physicists in particular, can we do? Well, I'll put it this way. I think there are really two groups that I've seen who routinely think on the fundamental level in large physical and energy and timescales relevant to contemplating the future of life as a whole: physicists, including astronomers, and philosophers. Only one of those groups can calculate things and also get listened to by those who are in power. So I think we have a unique capability and also a responsibility to do both of those things. No one else is going to do the job. And to close, and also atone for my cheap shot toward philosophers, I'm going to leave you with a quote from my favorite philosopher. People do not sufficiently realize that their future is in their own hands. Theirs is the task of determining, first of all, whether they want to go on living or not. There's the responsibility then for deciding if they want merely to live or intend to make just the extra effort required for fulfilling, even on their refractory planet, the essential function of the universe, which is a machine for the making of gods. Thank you.
Thanks. We're now actually at the 25-minute end of your talk. And although there were many questions that I can now see for Martin Rees, only a couple have come in for you. So I think it'll be best if we continue on with Sandra Faber's talk, and then there'll be almost half an hour for discussion and answers to questions. And then there'll be the other half an hour in the networking session afterwards that everybody's invited to join. So thanks very much, Anthony. And Sandy, could you start and share your screen?
Great. I hope you can all see that. And I'll start with profound thanks to the introductory thoughts by Martin and Anthony, who collectively have set up very nicely my concluding thoughts and what I want to say. So I'm going to talk about three things. This number, this is always the problem. There we go. This planet, and this notion. And I hope to convince you that even though they all seem familiar, in fact, we have a profound lack of understanding of all three. And this profound lack of understanding is the major obstacle standing in the way to our coming to grips with the challenge of planning and realizing our own future. So let me start. This number, what is it? This happens to be the number which, when raised to the power of 1 million, equals a factor of 2. What I'm going to talk about today is the future of our planet on a scale of 1 million years. And so if we were to grow annually at this number, after 1 million years, we would have grown by a factor of 2. And already today, we use in many categories half of the resources of the planet. And so therefore, in some ways, many ways, we can't grow more than a factor of 2. And the point of showing this, of course, is to illustrate graphically that we propose to exist on this planet for 1 million years. We really have to do so without any growth whatsoever. And that's what sustainability means. Now, in contrast, let's compare this number. 3% has been the traditional target for economic growth in modern societies. Raised to the millionth power is this number, 10 to a very large exponent. So this shows that our current economic system, capitalism, is simply not sustainable on cosmic timescales. Now, some people are very enamored of capitalism. For example, this quote by Nathaniel Branden, who was romantically involved with Ayn Rand and shared her rather conservative principles. Capitalism by its nature entails a constant process of motion, growth, and the key point here is progress. Now, my feeling about capitalism is negative, and I looked very hard to find a respected economic professor who would say the following words. So I couldn't find this. So these are my words. Interest and dividends are Ponzi schemes, both premised on future growth. Capitalism does not bestow growth as an option. It needs it. It feeds on it. And in so doing, it is devouring our planet. I wish I could have found famous economist X who had said these words. I looked very hard. I found several economists, but they would be considered among the fringe today by the mainstream of the profession. This is my view, though. I think that to promise and pay interest routinely for the whole society, year after year after year, is premised on growing GDP. And I don't think it's any accident that interest rates are of order the same level of growth in GDP. Now, I stress that not everybody agrees with me. Here is John Bogle, founder of mutual funds Vanguard. Capitalism is not a Ponzi scheme. Capitalism is a scheme of free markets. Well, you can see that there is no unanimity on this central point. And this is one of the aspects of ambiguity and lack of understanding that I think exists in our society today. we truly do not have a unified view on the consequences of the present system. Now, regardless of whether or not there's a theoretical understanding, I think we would all agree that in fact the system is looking like exponential growth. We tend to be fixated on energy use, but there are many other indices we could look at. Here's copper production. This is an exponential curve. Another problem is waste, not only what we consume, but what we waste that comes out of the system. And it too is growing exponentially. So there is a widespread opinion that this can be fixed because we can dematerialize the economy. Put simply, this means we can produce the same amount by using fewer materials. Well, here's an analysis of this in 57 different industries. The orange part of the curves would represent successful dematerializing in chemicals, computer hardware, the energy industry. Each one of these plots is a plot of K versus epsilon. K is technical performance. That is to say, it's a measure of higher production efficiency. That's good. Epsilon is the percent demand increase for that product divided by the percent increase in national income. It's a measure of elasticity of demand, and it's bad. And the net result is this analysis in 57 different industries showed without exception, not a single industry had achieved any degree of dematerialization. The black lines there would be zero growth on the environment. None of these industries has achieved that. So I think that this is a chimera. And I talked to many of my friends in Silicon Valley, and they seem to be convinced that technology will save us. It's not saving us thus far. Let me now turn to the second part of my talk, which is planet Earth, in particular, models for planet Earth. They've been improving lately. Here's a recent history. Every one of these little ovals means more complexity has been added to climate models. They're getting better and better. And by the way, this might be one of the very most important improvements due to AI if we can run more realistic climate models or system models of Earth. The problem with these models is that there really aren't any people in them yet. And people are extremely complicated. So here's a group of people a few years ago who decided that they would really try to model people crudely. And yes, nature is in the equation, but very, very simply. This is a simple model. There are only 4 equations. And the interesting thing is that it has an elite and commoners. Wealth is generated annually. It's the difference between production and consumption, but it goes into the pockets of the elites only. And elites are allowed to consume more according to this inequality factor, kappa equals 100. The rich elite is able to accumulate work from the wealth of the commoners. And therefore, when there's a crisis like a famine or something like that, the elite can spend their wealth to buy food and survive longer. And this creates a time delay. And it's well known that systems that are set up like this with opposing forces, predator-prey, for example, the snowshoe hare and the lynx in the Canadian forest, well known, it's now mathematical model for this kind of oscillation. And the absolute key point is that that makes it possible is that there's a bit of a time delay between one forcing function and the response. All right, so what happens when these folks run their models? Well, you can get a huge, wide variety of behavior, including these oscillatory phases that rather look like the Canadian forest. But 2 things really emerge from this picture. They oppose a stable equilibrium. The first was the very existence of wealth, which puts in a time delay, and the inequality factor. Whenever they ran their model with an inequality factor of more than 10, the model inevitably collapsed. That is to say, everybody ultimately starved. The commoners starved first and the elites starved later, but everybody starves. And I was looking at inequality factors in our science, in our society today. And the inequality factor in large corporations versus workers is now 1,000. And I would say also the existence of wealth is going into the hands of a small number of people. More and more our society is looking like this very simple model. And I think we would do well to absorb the lessons from this, but we do not. And this is another aspect of our ignorance that I want to point out. Our elites are in complete denial of these possibilities. It's happened many times in the past. Many societies have collapsed. We think we're immune. We're in a complete state of denial. And if you want to understand that, just read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, which I do every day. All right, now let me turn to point number 3, which is the question of human ethics and how we value the future. In order to plan a future, we have to have a vision for what is good and bad. And in order to get started with that, we need to understand where our human ethical system and principles actually come from. This is another area of great mystery for the average person. If you don't believe that, go around and ask your friends, ask your hairdresser, ask the fellow who carries your groceries out from the supermarket. Where do you get your notions of good and bad? And you will receive no uniform opinion. Large numbers of people you talk to will give this answer, that their ethics are divinely inspired and they follow the word of God. Okay? I don't mean to prioritize Judeo-Christianity here. There are many different religions and many adherents, and all of those people believe that their ethics are absolute and come from a higher power. There are many people who think that ethics are absolute, do the right thing because it is right. This is Immanuel Kant. This is his famous categorical imperative. So he envisioned that there was a right out there, the good, in quotes. And this is what human beings are obligated to follow. Doesn't necessarily come from God. Even more fundamental, stands there in flashing lights, needing no further justification. It's just the right thing. Some of the Greeks thought about ethics in the same way. Here's a quote attributed to Socrates. Of course, it came through Plato. A system of morality that is based on relative emotional values is a mere illusion. The understanding of mathematics is necessary for the profound grasp of ethics. Now, why in God's name did he think of that? The reason is that he was thinking that the harmony of the celestial spheres would somehow need to be reflected in the harmony of human civilization, human relationships. To understand the celestial spheres, you had to be a mathematician, and therefore you needed to be a mathematician to understand morality, human morality. Now, in recent years, there is a movement growing that is in great contrast to what I would say is historically the great mass of reflections of famous writers on the origin of ethics. And this new movement is called sociobiology or evolutionary ethics. It really started with Darwin, but it really took off in the 1950s at the hands of E.O. Wilson, who I think was mentioned already in his talk by Martin Rees. So here are some quotes from E.O. Wilson. Most agree, and by that he means social scientists working on this topic, most agree that ethical codes have arisen by evolution through the interplay of biology and culture. Cooperative individuals generally survive longer and leave more offspring. So what Wilson is saying, and people like him, is that human ethics have been honed by generations and generations of competitive and cultural evolution. And we have a certain strategy for making our living in this world, humans do, and our ethical system has been honed and tuned in order to make individuals following that strategy more successful. Okay, so here is a summary of the origin of ethics in the Encyclopedia Britannica by this woman, Doris Schroeder, who is a corporate psychologist. And she says, why should we be moral? Because we are genetically inclined to be moral. It is a heritage of earlier times when less morally inclined and more morally inclined species came under pressure from natural selection. Hence, we do not need divine revelation or strong will to be good. We are simply genetically wired to be good. So, this view sees the function of morality and ethics as a pragmatic tool to solve problems. And specifically, another social scientist like this, Dean Peterson, a leader in the field, he says the function of morality, or the moral organ, is to negotiate the inherent serious conflict between self and others. Now, going even beyond that, there's a very interesting man in South Africa, Mark Solms. He's a neuroscientist, and he believes and can argue very passionately and convincingly that yes, we have a moral organ that does computations, but we need a stick in order to make us actually follow the outcome of those computations, and that stick is feelings. Evolutionary forces are communicated at the level of the organism in the form of feelings, and the good feelings associated with these functions is what motivates us to do them. What's really interesting is, where is the site of feelings in our brains? It's not in the cortex. It is in the midbrain, even lower than and below the so-called famous limbic system. And if you believe that feelings are the governors that actually regulate the activities of organisms, then you're forced to conclude that there are many animals out there besides ourselves who have feelings. And the reason for feelings is to make morally significant decisions. Really completely changes your view about animals and their related to people. Okay, so it's the power of feelings that actually compels us to conform. And another leader in this field is Frans de Waal, who studied the origin of ethics in chimpanzees and other animals. And he's one of my heroes. Here's a quote from him: "Perhaps it's just me, but I'm wary of any persons whose belief system," by this, he's talking about the cognitive system, the frontal lobes, "is the only thing standing between them and repulsive behavior." No, he would trust somebody who is really repelled and disgusted by repulsive behavior. That is to say, someone who is responsive to their ethical feelings. So I can sum this up by another hero of mine said, Abraham Lincoln, of his own moral system: "When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. That is my religion." So back to Socrates for a moment. I deliberately included this quote: "A system of morality that is based on relative emotional values is mere illusion. How could anyone be more wrong? Our modern understanding of our evolutionary ethics and their origin completely denies the truth of this." And let me go beyond and now become controversial. 99% of what you will read about the nature of morals, the nature of ethics, and where they come from is really much more in the mold of these ancient writings. We deluge our young people with supposedly important, sacred, profound literature in high school and college. And on the most important question of the day, why do we want what we want and why do we behave? We don't give them any useful information whatsoever. So this is another gap in our understanding. In this case, we don't even understand ourselves. Okay, so with this newly emerging understanding of the fact that we are animals and our ethical system derived from the animals before us, how should we now think about valuing the future? Do we value the future?
Oh,
Well,
5-minute warning, Sandy.
okay, I'm almost done. Here is a sign in Santiago, Chile. Hay más futuro que pasado. There's more future than past. Probably that's still true, even if you're a pessimist. Since the future is big, there could be far more people in it. And if you want to do good, you should concentrate on benefiting future generations. That's one way to think about the ethics of the future. But the problem is, how much do we value future generations? Well, there are many experiments done by psychologists to tell us how we value the future. The most familiar is the exponential discount rate, which is the time value of money. If I lend you $1 today, a year from now, I expect to get something like $1. Here's the federal funds rate, 2%. That's the effective rate at which the Fed loans money to its partner banks. So this is an exponential discount rate. Every year, the future value of money goes down. At a discount rate of 2% at age 20, you're valuing your retirement years at only about a third the value of your current year. And at a discount rate of 2%, future generations have essentially zero value. That's a problem. Now, actually, humans don't appear to use an exponential discount rate. They use a hyperbolic discount rate, which declines more rapidly in the short term and much more slowly in the long term. But never mind, over a million-year period, we're still not valuing the future. And the point is, we weren't evolved to have that organ. We only had to worry about the next few years and our descendants. We're not tuned to think about the future. Okay, here's a second reason why humans might not care. It's this function of morality as a pragmatic tool to negotiate conflict. This view of morality sees moral codes as fundamentally transactional and needing a two-way street. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And here's another problem. Can we actually have a transaction with the future? What does the future have that we want? That, I think, is the absolute central question facing humanity in thinking about the future. All right, now I actually think that the future does have something that we want. And I believe this because I've asked many audiences this question, my informal. Imagine the Earth 1,000 years from now, it's a smoking ruin and it's our fault, just accept that. Is this good or bad? And audiences uniformly say 95% it's bad, 2% it's good, and 3% are confused. But the point is 95% people contemplating that say it is bad. Why? Well, in thinking about this question, I think I might have uncovered the essence of all human religions. I say this very modestly and ask you to reflect on what I have to say next. So here, I think, is the essence of what we worship and value. We intuitively respect low entropy and its creative possibilities. Thank you for setting up this concept. We feel awe and wonder at the complexity of Earth's biosphere, another aspect of the creative potential of low entropy. And our creation myths struggle to explain what seemed to us as an absolutely remarkable situation. Intuitively, we, without understanding cosmology, planetary science, etc., how are you going to account for the existence of Earth? The losses that we mourn are invariably increases in entropy. And putting this all together, we understand intuitively how improbable Earth is, and therefore how precious it is. And I'm wondering whether we really need a new religion that values and preserves Earth's low entropy and creative potential. So I hope I persuaded you the value of contemplating Earth's future on a 1,000,000-year timescale, not 100 years. It's 40,000 human generations. This removes the personal element. We can all think about Earth in the abstract, the Earth that we would like to design independent of our personal concerns. It certainly makes thinking about sustainability much harder and much more realistic. It also, though, gives time to adapt. 1,000,000 years is a long time, and the creativity potential is absolutely enormous and inspiring. So I think I've highlighted some areas of ignorance that need to be filled if we're going to think constructively about the long-term future of Earth. We would like to create an Earth Future Institute at UC Santa Cruz. It's a very small enterprise thus far. If there's a wealthy donor listening to me out there, I would love to hear from you if you're inspired by this idea. What would the program of such an institute be? There are many futures institutes. They're all valuable. They're studying important problems. But here I'm trying to fill niches that I think are not being looked at thus far. So the first is Earth systems modeling, model showing Earth's long-term carrying capacity. It might turn out to be very small. Maybe, maybe it will only be a few million people or intelligent beings, our descendants. If it's that small, maybe we don't need to bother. Maybe we just go out in a blaze of glory. But what are the choke points and can they be worked? Then we need economic models that do not depend on growth. We need socio-economic systems that damp out chaos. And I guarantee it's not democracy. And finally, we need to work hard on developing humanity's moral compass for the future. And that involves teaching everyone, all young children, where human values come from and the nature of human nature. The key point here is, are those values malleable? And can we learn to love the Earth enough to save it? So I'll stop there. Joel, you are muted.
I'll now share this slide. So we've now reached the time for panel discussion, and I'm also collecting questions from the audience to ask the panel. But let's first start with a discussion among the panel, Martin, Anthony, and Sandra. So please start.
Can I, do you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I mean, one concern I have really, which is implicit in my talk, is that we really can't foresee things very far ahead because of rapid change. And human beings in a recognizable form, if they change on a technological timescale, not doing evolution, may be very different 500 years from now. So that means we don't know what their wants and their tastes will be like beyond even a few hundred years. So I am slightly skeptical about these very long-term predictions and about the extent to which we can make provision for a better long-term, and we don't know about it. And listening to Anthony, I wondered why he didn't mention aliens. He was talking about humans for the next billions of years spreading through. But if there are aliens out there which are more advanced and with a greater capacity for happiness, then by invading their territory, we're making a negative contribution. So the scenario which Anthony discussed is, I would have thought, predicated on there being no aliens. Maybe that's right, but I think it's an option we can't rule out.
Yeah. Sandy, do you want to go first, or I can respond to the aliens question?
Take the aliens and then I'll go second.
Yeah, you're right. Of course, I think there are several scenarios. So I think there's a scenario where there's some stupendously improbable thing in evolutionary history, and we're just surprisingly alone. So I think that's a surprisingly large probability in my view, but other people disagree certainly. Another view is that it's all over out there, and somehow it's staying hidden and not doing any very large scale, engineering of stars or galaxies. And right. I find that a bit surprising, honestly, because it doesn't, this is the famous Fermi paradox. It's just doesn't take that long in history of the universe to colonize a galaxy and do some significant things to it. So if they're filling the universe with technology, they're being surprisingly quiet about it. The third possibility, I think, is similar to somewhere in between, that they're out there, but we just haven't contacted them yet. And I think this is a possibility if civilizations expand roughly at the speed of light, then we simply won't have seen them, because by the time we see them, they will be here. And so this is a sort of rare other civilizations. But in that case, the incentive is to start expanding first, because as soon as you won't get any warning, you'll just see some new civilization, and there you are, and it'll probably be more advanced than you, unless you get fairly lucky.
Yes. Can I go back and say why I'm skeptical of this? First, I mean, Darwinian evolution favors intelligence and aggression. And so it's natural to imagine that if we go on wanting people to expand their territory, etc. But future evolution is not going to be Darwinian selection. It's going to be directed by technology. And it's no reason why it should be aggressive. And it may well be that all kinds of intelligences which are leading contemplative lives, very high bit rate of processing data in a machine, and not wanting to expand, not use much energy at all. And I don't see why that is less likely, because aggression is not necessarily feasible for computers.
True, but it just takes one that's wedded to the 3% economic growth that Sandy points out forever. To want to get its 10 to the 13,000 or whatever expansion, and then that one, even if there are lots of contemplatives around, it's just going to take that one. So you could be right, certainly, and it could be that there's an attractor that once intelligence gets advanced enough, it just wants to become all virtual or cocoon itself in quantum computers around black holes, or who knows. There could be some kind of late stage point that is suggested by the basic fundamentals of the universe that draws most civilizations into it, and that could account for it. There are, as you know, many solutions to the Fermi paradox, and we all have to choose our own portfolio.
Can I speak up as to your first point, Martin, in which you were skeptical of predictions over more than a few decades, let alone a million years. Let me just clarify, I didn't make a single prediction. That's not my business. And I totally agree with you. There's the point is simply to say that we have a process going here that is most remarkable. We've invested 13.6 billion years in this process. And to have it just be snuffed out of inadvertent inattention and selfishness is somehow bad. And the question that we need to address is, why is it somehow bad? And I tried to give my own personal explanation for this, that actually we do have inherent in each one of us a respect and love of low entropy and appreciation for it. And that's what our Earth is all about. So no, I'm not predicting anything over a million years, please. I just want to hold open the possibility.
Another place where I think there's maybe some divergence, Sandy, is I have the sense, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that you're pretty pessimistic about the possibility of spreading off, life or civilization off Earth, and sort of see it as this is what we have to work with, is the Earth's, material bounty and biosphere and sort of the constraints that we have. And I'm curious as to why. I mean, sure, you certainly know lots of people don't think that. So I'm curious as to why, if you do, you've come to that sort of view.
I do have that view, but it's rather uninformed. And I think, in my view, so I guess I'm concentrating on making the most of Earth because I don't see any obvious automatic avenues for expansion beyond that. Yes, maybe so, but I'm not counting on that. Why do I feel that way? It's because, it's not as though we lack power or size to colonize the galaxy. It's that our lifetimes are too short. And so actually one of the great promises, you mentioned it, of genetic engineering would be to engineer intelligent beings with much longer lifespans. And I just don't understand it's the information processing challenges of making entities that are capable of living long enough. And at the same time, it's a dynamic range problem, because as human beings, we have to deal with very rapid changes in our environment. We can fall downstairs instantly. So to have that rapid response capability and live 10,000 years at the same time, that's an enormous dynamic range in response times. I just don't know if that's even theoretically capable by any chemical system, biochemical. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I think I suspect that if we had a long time and evolution is really, really good, and it's really, really good at engineering the ability to evolve under selective pressure. So I suspect that if we had 1,000 or 10,000 generations where there was an evolutionary selective pressure for longevity, that we would become 500 or 1,000-year-old beings eventually. We might be able to do it faster, if we're actually trying. So I think that will take. So aging seems like a really, really difficult problem because there's so many things involved and so many different things go wrong. But at the same time, we know age varies tremendously among organisms, and it's not particularly clear why some shark lives 500 years and a mouse lives, 1.
Mm-hmm.
What accounts for that gigantic difference? There are metabolic issues, of course, but why one can be stable informationally for so long is not so clear. So it may be that there are solutions and that we can, again, I think this is a real application for AI, I think, because I think the way that the genome is turned into an actual organism is much more like a computer program, a very, very both hacked together and incredibly efficient and ingenious computer program than like a recipe. And so figuring out how to engineer that is going to be very, very hard. And I think machine learning will help with that. So I think we don't know, but it seems it's hard to imagine why we couldn't live a couple of 100 or 300 years, whether we could live 10,000, as you say, and still sort of be human and stay sane and operate effectively. Yeah, great question.
But you're assuming that we remain flesh and blood. You're not imagining we have progeny who are electronic.
Yeah.
That's
certainly an interesting. Lots of people, I think, are going down that road of, we'll become digital minds and computer hardware is the future. And it certainly has a lot of pluses to it. I'm a little bit less convinced that the way to go out into the universe is to become computer hardware, and because computer hardware is actually not that durable in a sense. That if you want error correction, biological systems are really good at it. And I think if you increase the necessity of error correction in biological systems, you might end up doing better than trying to do a digital system that can have very little error correction, very little errors in it, is very fragile in a sense, rather than a biological one. So I'm not totally convinced that of the two, the digital versus the biological in the 100 years from now, given huge advances in computing and huge advances in biology, that it's obvious that the digital one will be the way to go out into the solar system or beyond, rather than the biological one. I certainly agree. We'll want to engineer things because we're not particularly suited for space.
Let me ask some of the questions that people have been asking in the Q&A. Bill Colglazier, past chair of the Forum on Physics and Society, who worked in the State Department, says, great talks. I'm surprised by minimal discussion of the hardest question. Can our politics deal with these challenges? Diplomats at the UN are focused on science, technology, and innovation for making progress on sustainable development goals by 2030. What advice do you have for these diplomats?
Well, I did mention this, that politicians will only take long-term global decisions if they feel the public's behind them. And that's why it's so important to have the Pope and David Attenborough and the rest of them who will make the public care. I mean, I think we had an example of this in the UK when the ministers started to legislate against non-reusable plastic drinking straws and things like that. This only happened because our secular Pope David Attenborough had his BBC programs, which had sensitized people to the problem of pollution in the oceans, which had not been a big issue for the public until 2 or 3 years ago. And so that's an example of how the public can become aware and care about something if some charismatic people persuade them to. And then the politicians, I think, will be prepared to do this sort of thing. But otherwise, obviously, they will focus on their own electorate and the timescale up to the next election. But I'm hopeful that if the public is enlightened and the public cares about this and cares about the lives of their grandchildren, etc., then politicians will take decisions which have a long-term benefit and not just short-term.
So Lucy Fortson has a question for you, Martin. She says, as you say, if someone can do something, they will. And given that biotech and AI can be harnessed for negative intent by only a few malevolent actors that can have a global impact, how can we prevent this from happening? She says, will privacy need to take a backseat to survivability?
Well, this is my worst nightmare because I don't see how we can prevent this happening unless we have very intrusive surveillance of everyone all the time. So I said that there's a trade-off between privacy, security, and freedom. And I think we're going to have to tilt the balance because it only takes one weirdo, a small group, or the kind of person who maybe thinks there are too many human beings on the planet and doesn't care who he kills. One such person is too many. And I do think we are going to have to give up privacy or liberty in order to ensure that we can minimize this risk.
Here's a question for Sandra Faber from Charles Hughes. In your opinion, is it possible to construct a large-scale society that does not accumulate increasing wealth and resources into the hands of a decreasing few? A limited read of history suggests resource inequality is a persistent feature, but is it an inevitable one?
No, I don't think it's inevitable, but it requires a revised moral code. And up to now, we're suffering or acting under the moral code that we've inherited as a result of our evolution. And much of it, not all of it, is based on competition and increase in power, increase in influence, and so on. That has stood us in good stead up to now and needs to be changed if we're going to have a long-term future on Earth. So how to do that, that's why I said, how malleable are the tenets of our moral code? That's really the essence of why I said that. Can we change our view? Let me just say, we have had massive changes in our moral code that are very significant. We look, I grew up during the era in which we had contraceptives for the first time. And when I was a young woman, virginity of females was highly prized and loss thereof was penalized. And now in our country, most of us hardly worry about that. I mean, that was a precept that governed the lives of half the population, and that's only a few decades ago. And then our changes about slavery, women's suffrage, numerous very seemingly fundamental concepts that we have held have changed with time. So I'm hopeful, actually, that the content of our moral code, not its existence, but its content, is malleable.
Here's a question from Dan Holtz. He says, thanks for fantastic and alarming talks. What lessons can be drawn from the global response to the ongoing pandemic, and what this heralds for our ability to confront other existential threats, such as climate change? In particular, what are your thoughts on the apparent infodemic compromising rational discourse? Anyone like to respond to that?
Anthony, that sounds like for you.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I mean, I think the lesson from COVID is largely a negative one, at least in most of the countries involved. We've done a fairly terrible job, I would say, and part of that is particular to countries, but part of it is particular to the way we've set up our societies. They're simply not doing the very large scale preparation, and they're not able to act sort of quickly and in a unified manner in the face of a threat. So I think that bodes poorly. That the only silver lining may be if we actually learn something from this. I mean, I think if you're about to cross a street and you just about get hit by a car and you pull yourself back, it changes the way you think for a while. And but not that long. So I think there's a window of opportunity for us to take advantage of the fact that we see this fragility and that we understand that we can save ourselves, by spending 1% of the potential cost of some calamity, we can prevent that calamity, and that's just an unbelievably good deal. There's so much that we could have done before COVID came that would have cost, tens or at most hundreds of billions of dollars for something that was probably a 20 or 30% chance to happen in a decade, to prevent it. So we have to get smarter about thinking about expected value. There are these unbelievable bargains lying around where we can spend a little bit of money to prevent calamities, and we don't do it. So I'm hopeful we'll take that lesson. The infodemic, I think, is a real problem. We call it the news, and it feels like not that important, but the news is the entire sensory and sort of information processing system of our civilization, and it's badly broken. The fact that, well, we all know this. So what can be done about it? We have, I think, come to a place where the old system sort of it has been broken and is not going to come back. We're not going to go back to Walter Cronkite on the evening news telling everybody the news they need to hear. We have to come up with systems that we've deliberately designed to have the right properties, that pay attention to things that are actually important and that reward things that are true. And if we don't create systems with the right incentives, we'll keep systems with the incentives they have now, which is everybody hears things that happen to spread the most efficiently in a sort of mimetic way by systems that reward spreading and attention grabbing. So I think people want that. I think people want information that is true, and is interesting and insightful. And I think if we create those systems, at least some people will use them. But right now, there is no system. There's no really good preferred system that if I say I just want to understand what's actually going on in the world, here's the new system that I'm going to use. Doesn't exist. So we should at least build that, and have some early adopters who want to use actually good and useful truth-finding system, and hopefully then it will spread. That's my personal view. That's something I'm actually a little bit involved in now.
Here's a question from Ed Seidowitz for Sandy Faber. societies seem to always create elites. Elites always want to maximize their short-term advantage. So how do you build a society that becomes stable over time rather than collapsing? Is that possible?
Well, I don't know if it's possible, but I think, again, another use of AI is to model possible societies. And a society is organized around its penalty and reward structure. And that's what we would need to tinker with in order to set up a society that would have long-term prospects. So I'm not sure that it's possible given our current set of moral values, but if we were willing to work hard to change those values, then it might be possible. That's a major question that I think needs to be investigated further. It's an unknown.
Here's a question from Anonymous. Because of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and things we can't imagine, humans in any recognizable form may not exist 1,000 years from now, let alone 1,000,000.
And therefore?
Not a question, I guess. But, what's your response to that?
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, I agree with that.
True.
And we don't know what their taste and their ethics is going to be.
But as you remarked, Martin, the one thing that they won't have is natural selection, a la Darwin.
Right.
The selection will be by some other mechanisms and
right.
with other
Yeah, and I think we can guess that they will value their own existence. And so I think one, almost independent of what they're like, one thing that we can do for those future generations is to allow them to exist by not destroying everything now, frankly, in the next 50 or 100 years, as Martin has talked about.
Yes.
Because they would appreciate that.
Yes.
It's the least we can do, right? It's just good courtesy.
The end of the session, but people who are watching through the American Physical Society window, you simply have to move down to the bottom of your screen and click on Join After Session Networking. And the members of the panel, please do the same thing. So log on as regular APS audience members, and then join the after session networking. And that's a normal Zoom session where everybody can talk to everybody else, and it won't be where people have to type in their questions to the Slido side. So thanks very much to all of the panelists. These talks, of course, were all recorded and will be available very soon after the session ends for people who want to rehear or watch the presentations that you might have missed. But I think the session is now officially closed, and people should now go to the Join After Session Networking.
Yes.